Hello again, this is Colin Talbot, part of our series on the way in which governments are responding to the COVID crisis. Not just governments, but media and business and third sector organisations and so on, but we're concentrating on government responses. I'm very lucky today to be joined by three experts on the media and journalism to talk about particularly the journalistic response and government communications in the USA and the UK. Kate Ironside and Tim Crook are from the UK, based in the UK, and Emily Bell's based in the USA, which will be an interesting topic for conversation, I suspect. So if we just go around and introduce yourselves, should we start with Kate?
I'm Kate Ironside. I'm a former political journalist, worked for both the Daily Express and BBC Westminster for many years. I'm now a senior lecturer in journalism at the University of Northampton, and I sit on the executive board of the Broadcast Journalism Training Council.
We go anti-clockwise. Tom, do you want to?
Yes, I'm Tim Crook. I'm
Tim, sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Did it again.
Tom, actually. I'm professor of media law and ethics and journalism and other things at the Department of Media Communications and Cultural Studies, Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm also president of the Chartered Institute of Journalists.
Thanks very much. And Emily?
I'm Emily Bell. I am director of something called the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School, where I also teach journalism, and I still keep my hand in writing about media.
Thank you. Okay, well, I thought we'd start off with a brief discussion about the context in the UK and the USA and the way in which the media landscape's been changing before it's been struck by the corona outbreak and all of the changes that that's brought upon us. In some cases, accelerating things that were already happening. So I wonder if we start with you, Emily, and just have a brief discussion about the media landscape in the USA in particular.
Sure. Well, we've had a very interesting 3 years since really the election of Donald Trump in 2016. The media landscape here has been, I think, certainly from sort of a political news point of view, has been rather sort of different to anything anyone can remember, which is you've had actually, I suppose, sort of three things happening simultaneously. Two of which were expected, one of which was unexpected. The expected things were that there's been a general shift in power and money away from traditional media outlets to technology platforms, particularly Google and Facebook in the advertising market, which has had a pretty disastrous effect on local news, even before the coronavirus crisis. So there's been a sort of a long running existential crisis in terms of how we fund particularly reporting newsrooms. That's one thing. The second thing is just consumer behaviour. Far more sources are available to people, and the way they consume them is very, very different. So 70% of adults in America get their news during the week through social media at some point. The vast majority of those are coming through Facebook and YouTube, which really means that the sort of, if you like, the narrow window of consensus previously occupied by the mainstream media but the outlets has blown apart somewhat. So we have a much wider variety of voices and perhaps sometimes more polarized voices as well. And then the third thing that nobody really anticipated was the election of a president who does not really see the press or regard the press in the same way as previous presidents, to put it mildly. He bases he's developed a very antagonistic relationship with the press. He uses the authoritarian playbook to invert the truth, undermine the press, call them fake news, etc., etc. He's actually very media savvy. He's probably the most media savvy president we've had. But it means that at a time of sort of financial threat as well, you also have a real battle, if you like, for the truth or controlling the narrative in this country. And I think that rather like other countries, we now have a set of elected officials who realise that they do not have to respond to journalist questions. They don't have to go through the mainstream media. They don't even have to tell the truth in order to be elected. So that's a brief outline of what was going on here pre-coronavirus.
Is it just worth pointing out, particularly for a UK audience, which some of the people watching this will be, that there is a key difference in the US as well, which is you didn't have the same sort of national print media that we have in the UK.
That's right.
That you know, you have one or two newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are widely read, but it's not the same as we have here, where we have a whole series of national titles.
That's right. In fact, I often say to sort of students to encourage the idea of difference or thinking about it, that in the US, things like cable news are much more like the national press in the UK, in that they're partisan and noisy, and there are quite a few of them. Whereas actually the sort of the print outlets, traditional print outlets, tiny bit more like kind of regional television or broadcast here, much more kind of centre of the road, very sort of regionally based. Having said that, the Washington Post and the New York Times are now becoming national and international media brands, and the Wall Street Journal, in ways maybe that they weren't pre-digitally. So, but that's right. Yes, good clarification.
Thanks. Okay, Tom and Kate, should we just talk briefly about the UK situation? Who wants to go first? Kate? Tom, go on.
No, I defer to Kate.
Right. Well, I would say that in many ways the challenges are similar. You've got the newspaper industry really struggling to reconfigure, and this is a very, very long trend since the birth of the internet. Newspapers historically dependent on both advertising income and sales of newspapers to fund journalism. They have seen the advertising income migrate away. I mean, as Emily knows all too well, the struggle to make newspapers profitable, to be able to fund proper journalism without that advertising income is a real challenge. There were many local papers were on their knees before the coronavirus began. National newspapers have been seriously struggling. And one of the big difficulties is that so much of the competition is available free online. And so you're making the move to digital, which is a rapidly developing platform. You know, you think you've set up your operation one way, and then the technology changes again, and you've got to change your operation again. But you are up against effectively rivals providing their services for free, and of course the broadcasters are struggling because we've moved to television on demand. And so the days when the entire family sat around one TV set and watched the same programs, and then the TV news came on and you all naturally watched the TV news, have gone. And so, viewing figures are down. The BBC's been beating itself up that its audience is predominantly old. How does it reach that younger generation fixated on YouTube and social media? This is a real challenge for British journalism, is to reach out to those younger audiences who, after all, are their core customers in the future.
Yeah. Tim?
Yes, that's a very accurate and comprehensive picture. And there are some other complicating factors that have added to the perfect storm. The big brands have been adopting a practice known as ad blocking, choosing for the money they spend, particularly in nationals online, not to be connected to the very depressing, harrowing, tragic news of the developing COVID-19 emergency. The other factors, I accept completely this predatory, very powerful explosion and development of the global online corporations. So national governments, whereas previously they'd seen the public service importance, the civic importance of a new medium, i.e. radio and television, they didn't see the implications of online and how a profit-based, profit-led corporation can exploit that, particularly in the field of advertising. They've been very ungenerous. I'm talking about the large global corporations, very ungenerous to the traditional media. On the one hand, they try to deny that they're not publishers, that they're just processing platforms. On the other hand, they're ruthless commercial operations and exploit what is linked, and they can connect to, and they can provide through their publishing platforms, generated through the very hard professional work of qualitative journalism publishers. Then there's another factor which the Chartered Institute of Journalists strongly feels, is that the industry, the journalism industry itself, and leading thinkers and education, they've failed to add into the idea of media literacy the importance of teaching younger generations the importance, the value of the newspaper. If the book can still remain a valid cultural form, a source of education. In many respects, you can understand why that's happened. Industry got so excited and also terrified about the implication, but the new media online, the internet, was so exciting. And in the process, the professional journalist has become overworked, overstretched, needs to be multi-skilled. Yes, great opportunities, magnificent ways to improve the way of your reporting, your investigations and research. But then the compromise, the exploitation by employers. So it's not a good situation. As for the performance of professional media in the United Kingdom in the context of COVID-19, I've got some very positive things to say about that, but I'll wait until I get the question.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered if we could just talk very, very briefly about the if you like, the organisational technical impact of the COVID crisis, and particularly the lockdown problem. And we've had some quite amusing scenes of journalists locked away in broom cupboards in their houses trying to report on what's going on. And I just wonder how disruptive that's been to particularly the traditional media, in terms of them just being able to physically operate as normal and report on all of this. I think you've been doing some work on that in the States, Emily.
Yeah, that's right. We're doing a big survey with the ICFJ on how this is changing practice within the newsroom. And obviously we know it from our own work and in our classrooms and the newsrooms that we work with, things have radically changed. So yes, remote reporting, should that be a thing? We see things like quite interesting actually and innovative things. I would completely sort of second what Tom says about having very positive things to say about how the media has been conducting itself here during coronavirus. So one of the things that you now have to do as a journalist is, in a way, you have to train your own sources to record their material in a way that you can be confident that, you know, it's authentic and what have you. So we've seen some really startling footage coming out of hospitals in New York, which is very much the epicenter of the pandemic, both in the US and actually now in the world. And a lot of that has been not actually kind of taken by big crews going in, but either by just one journalist with who has access with a doctor, or more often with a medic actually being able to sort of film and talk to the audience themselves, which is a sort of, it's actually been very powerful, I think, but it's very restrictive, you know, that if you can't go out and experience, or you shouldn't be going out and experiencing the environment, it's difficult to report. We've had quite a number of reporters who've actually contracted the disease, particularly as a result of reporting things like the first clusters here. So newsrooms actually shut down pretty early in that process. We're also finding that there is a division between newsrooms that can produce remotely. So in other words, where everyone can produce from home, and where they have to go into the office to do it, thereby sort of putting some of their staff at risk. So it's sort of been interesting. I think we've also seen a real sort of focus on things like data, which obviously people are fascinated by the numbers, but it's another source, if you like, which doesn't have to actually be sort of tracked down into the streets. So there are lots and lots of challenges, but I think, you know, one of the great things about journalism is it's actually pretty flexible to challenge. I think that we get a very bad rap when people talk about how non-innovative and stuck in their old ways reporters are. That's not my experience here. I think we're seeing some very innovative, good reporting, despite the fact that, like everybody else, journalists are locked inside their own homes.
Tim, you've been nodding vigorously. Could you?
Yes, no, in agreement. Right from the word go, the Institute, we had two priorities. One, to brief all our members and the wider journalist community on safety, working in a new hazardous environment. The Committee to Protect Journalists in the USA done brilliant work in that respect. Very, very important. The other thing was to make sure that we were properly recognised professional journalists as key workers, and we very quickly persuaded the Council for Police Chiefs to recognise that. I've been enormously impressed with the work of professional journalists in all sectors, all arenas. I can immediately remember really impressive reports, for example, from Sky News in Italy, and also in care homes, and how that actually led the agenda and had the respect of government and changed policy. Equally, the BBC and other broadcasters. I think journalists have adapted very well. They haven't got any excuse because mobile journalism has been the buzzword, especially and in higher education for many years. It also reminds me of, so many foreign correspondents never actually left their living room because they would monitor radio, television. All of their clients want them every half hour, and they'd interview people by telephone and hardly ever go out. So yeah, there's a lot to draw on. But overall, I've been enormously impressed. I think professional journalists, despite the problematization, the prejudice against us, and the propagandizing by lobby groups and political and public figures with agendas, I think we've done very, very well indeed, and are continuing to do so.
No, I do. I mean, I do think there've been so many innovative ways of working. The best way to sound, for good quality radios, to do it under your duvet. It has been brilliant. But also, actually, I think this is going to set the pattern for the future. Certainly, home working can be much cheaper for employers than funding big offices. And I think you are going to see the innovations that have been forced on the industry through necessity will have a lasting effect in reshaping working practice after the pandemic. And it's fascinating seeing the new ground that is being broken and what you can actually achieve out of the office, which is marvellous.
Yeah, I wonder if we could sort of switch slightly to talking about the relationship between the media and government a bit more. And in particular, I mean, in relation to what we've just been talking about, though, about the physical restrictions that have been placed on people. I mean, the daily press briefings in the UK from 10 Downing Street, where the reporters are now dialing in on a screen, but they've carried on doing the whole podium thing with the which seems to have changed the balance, to me at least watching, seems to have changed the balance of power between the reporters and the people. And it just seems to me that face-to-face contact, that eyeballing of the politicians, has actually reduced considerably the ability of journalists to try and hold them to account. Kate, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, having been in that situation in Downing Street, there is... there's no substitute for being in the same room and literally, as you say, eyeballing them, and you're able to follow up. And particularly, it was very awkward at the beginning when you couldn't have the follow-up questions. The psychology of it, they're still on their podiums. Journalists were clearly on their laptops in their living rooms. The journalists were made to look amateurish. They were at the mercy of the link and the lead minister deigning to allow them on, able to cut them off. Oh, sorry, couldn't quite hear you. Never mind, let's go to the next person. And it was also sort of different discipline in these settings. There's a lot of criticism, particularly at the beginning, of journalists asking a series of questions in their one slot, and then, of course, the ministers and the experts dodging the most tricky ones or just answering the easy ones. And without the follow-ups, that was, very, very poor. And the failure, I mean, once upon a time, the Westminster PAC used to operate as a PAC. Now it's, particularly with the broadcasters, they're under pressure to get a particular clip to fit the particular package that their editors are anticipating are going to lead the bulletin. And there's much less collaboration. And so in this setting, it means that if a minister dodges a question or fails to answer it properly, your colleagues your journalistic colleagues are not going to follow up and press home the point.
Right.
And that is such an important, which we used to do all the time in the press conferences that I used to attend at Downing Street. But they weren't these televised sort of showcases.
Tom, did you want to add something on the UK?
I completely agree. I think one of the most startling media conferences was at the Scottish Government when Nicola Sturgeon was endeavouring to defend a chief medical officer. And there you had an example. I don't know whether it was previous collaboration, but the Scottish journalists remained on the focus, and it was the biggest car crash in a government media conference I've ever seen. And led to resignation. The journalists have got a lot to learn in the Zoom, particularly the Zoom, because Skype seems to be somewhat overshadowed. How to present yourself properly. Some of the hard bitten and robust and tenacious correspondents are suddenly appearing so charming and mellow when you see the backdrop of their living rooms. There's Norman Smith with a picture of Paddington Bear. I think it probably his father or a beloved relative in army uniform. Kate's absolutely right. If you're in this new situation with the powerful ministers on the podium, and the journalists sort of anatomized, reduced to a little electronic and fuzzy video block, and they have trouble muting and unmuting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we've got to wise up, and we've got to actually return the authority.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough,
it is worth noting that is only just a tiny part of the news gathering, and there's an awful lot of questioning of government going on over the phone. Yeah. It's just so visible.
Can I just, if we switch to the US for a minute, because I mean, certainly watching the Trump press conferences, if we think it's bad in the UK, I saw somebody saying that Trump was essentially turning these presidential press briefings into substitutes for his mass rallies, and just pontificating and going on about his ratings and so on, in just an extraordinary way. Emily, would you like to say something about that?
I mean, it's not that extraordinary if you've been watching Trump for the past 4 years. It's exactly what we would expect, but you're completely right, Colin. It is the mass rally was really the cornerstone, not just of Trump's campaign, but also of how he sort of exercised power and found agenda items in a way. So having sort of been deprived of those, particularly in 2020 in the run-up to the election, he has been using the White House daily briefings much more like that. And this has given, that there's a very sort of formal, that there's a formality about the relations between the press and the government in the US, which I would say is actually, just generally speaking, much more kind of grave and respectful traditionally than it has been in the UK, where, the fourth estate came from, the parliamentary gallery and the sort of, the sort of peanut throwers or whatever. Here it's always had a sort of mutual respect, and that's completely gone. Completely sort of unprecedented. You have the editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times saying, we're just not going to put journalists in the room. So unlike the UK, you can still be in the room for these briefings because they don't have any news in them. They often entail us amplifying contradictory or wrong information. And so what we'd rather do is take the live feed of the television, of the television, and then contextualize it, fact check it, etc., instead of just being a kind of a conduit for what's effectively a sort of not just a rally, but also a kind of key source of disinformation. And so there's been just a fascinating, if you like, sort of, kind of, I wouldn't call it a dance or a battle, but somewhere in between sort of, how access journalism here works, and really the breaking of very sort of very firmly held and respected traditions in terms of those two relations. So that's been sort of astonishing. On the other hand, you have somewhere here like Andrew Cuomo and his daily briefing. So I think the other thing to stress is it's not like the UK in that governors, state governors, have much more power in the US over immediate crises situations than, say, your local council would have in the UK. So Andrew Cuomo's daily briefings have become a study in good information design and press relations. So he has the press in the room. He's not a very popular governor, but he's a very good crisis leader. So he's a bit like, the Churchillian parallels hold in that lots of his sort of peacetime policies have not been very popular, and he's been seen as being a bit of a bully. He's actually been doing the job in terms of coronavirus. He just shows the same slides and information every single day, no spin, straight talk, no obfuscation. And it's been a real contrast in media styles between the White House and between, as it were, sort of the person who outside the White House has probably had the most attention on them. But just to back to sort of how it is like the US, I think like the UK, one of the real areas I think of sort of waking up, as Tom put it, has been that you really need on something like this expert reporters who are science and health reporters asking the politicians the questions. And I have huge respect for Robert Peston. I think he's a great journalist. I thought there was a very bad moment in the UK where they were using the Peston leak to try out sort of policies like herd immunity, etc. And somebody was saying, yeah, but that's just a journalist doing their job. It kind of is, but the problem is when you're not an expert journalist, you don't really know the right questions to follow up on. And we're dealing with something here which is very much not like politics.
Absolutely.
And one of the difficulties is that so many journalists come from humanities backgrounds. They are not science trained. Right. And I think we are seeing that weakness now. I mean, there were some brilliant journalists, and particularly the data journalists. I'd take my hat off to them. But should we say your conventional, Westminster-based journalists, that by and large they are not scientists, and so this is sort of virgin territory for them.
I think that's right.
I mean, if we could just. Before you come into it, two things. One is I think there's been an interesting contrast in the UK between the Westminster briefings, the number 10 briefings, and what's been going on in Scotland in particular, Nicola Sturgeon's briefings. But I also wondered if any of you could comment on Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand's got a lot of attention for the way in which she's been briefing on the New Zealand situation. And I just wondered if any of you watched any of that or had any comment on that as well.
Well, I think
Tim,
Tim, go on.
Kate, no, so please do. Yeah.
I mean, I think Jacinda Ardern's done very, very well. She can mix, straightforward down the line explanation of facts and circumstances with moments of very light touch. Her plea to explaining to the kids that the Easter Bunny was still a key worker, but on a more serious point, she is getting over the key material. Actually, I think Angela Merkel has done very well too. It's straightforward, unvarnished. Where Westminster has struggled, I think, is too often they're putting up people who clearly don't have authority. They don't actually have anything particular to say apart from the latest death toll and exhortations to everybody to stay inside, which leaves them very exposed. And you're thinking, well, what's the point of this?
Yeah, just before you come in, Tim, I one of the things that struck me as well is that most of the politicians talking at the UK number 10 briefings, and they have swapped them round at an alarming rate, none of them have scientific backgrounds either. So you've got a bunch of social science and humanities trained politicians talking to a bunch of social science and humanities trained journalists about something which is immensely technical, and it struck me as not a terribly productive dialogue. Tim, you wish to come in?
Well, there's the self-perpetuating elite there operating right at the top of politics, government and media, isn't it? So dare I say Oxford politics, philosophy, economics.
The other PPE.
Well done. Bingo, snap, that's brilliant. The biggest problem a lot of them have got, just talking about politicians and experts, is they don't want to say what might be the truth.
Yeah.
We don't know.
I think Tim's right there, and also I think, you know, here is something which is very difficult for both politicians and journalists to deal with, which is we are living with a large degree of uncertainty. And I think we've seen a very interesting contrast between what you need from effective public health messaging and what discourse between, you know, the press and politicians regularly throws up. So, for instance, you know, in effective messaging in health crises, and, you know, if you look at research attaching to both, you know, SARS and MERS and also HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things which is clear is that you have to get people to behave in a particular way without really knowing what the truth is.
Yeah.
And that's a very different, that's a sort of, I think, a very different plane that we're operating on as well. So I think it's absolutely true. Both sort of Kate and Tim's points are very well made about how you don't have perhaps the right level of insight and knowledge from your press and politicians in science. But I also think that there's something else happening here, which is, you know, we want to always be telling the truth or catching people out on not telling the truth. It's become very difficult for people to say, we just don't know. I mean, if you look at masks and mask wearing, you've had to get a population, so I can't go outside now without a mask on. 2 months ago, we were told, don't buy masks, don't wear masks. It has no effect on whether or not, you know, kind of the infection rate. You have to move populations sometimes through behaviors for certain ways, and it's very uncomfortable for journalists because it is, as Tim was saying, propagandistic. You know, it makes you feel, to what extent do we fall in line and amplify the message that keeps people safe, versus to what extent can we say, well, we don't really know about this, versus actually projecting something which is sounds definite but is probably completely false. And I think that living with ambiguity is something that actually journalists really ought to be doing to help, you know, explain the situation to their communities, which is,
Can we just do a quick round of any final comments, because we're coming up against the time barrier. I know this is absolutely fascinating. We could probably go on for hours. We may be able to come back to it because I suspect this is going to run as an issue over the coming months. So I wonder if we could just do a quick round of any final things that you wanted to add in that you think we haven't covered. Anybody want to go first?
Shall I? Very, very briefly, we've got to be careful about kind of sort of comparing countries, you know, sort of COVID journalism, tourism. I mean, New Zealand is so different to the United Kingdom population size. New Zealand doesn't have the busiest, most complex travel hub in the world, Heathrow Airport. You know, we're a very densely populated country, and so different in the urban areas and in terms of distribution of wealth and the way people live and work. The last thing I would say, my students about to go into the profession, it's been so disruptive and anxious ridden. And I said to them, I invited them to remember that you'll be the generation that's been dealing with the most challenging story that you're in the middle of since the Second World War. And how you approach that and the way you evolve through that, that will make you a generation much prized and much wanted in the future for advice and for leadership.
Thank you. That's good. Kate?
Okay, I'd like to go just with a thought about the reader and the viewer. We've been talking very much about governments and the media. Very often people who consume journalism are reading stories that don't directly affect them. This is a story with a profound effect on everybody. Everybody feels they've got a stake in it. And, you know, their interests may be varied, be it the fact that they think they're going to lose their job, that they've got elderly relatives in care homes, they've got young children, but everybody personally is affected by this news story. And also, everybody is under a fair amount of unusual stress. You had the Irish Taoiseach advise people to stop watching the news for their mental health. So people are consuming news through this prism of stress and through this prism of this is a story everybody is intensely involved in. It's not, you can't park, that's an economy story, or that's about a hospital, that's about a business story, but it doesn't affect me. This affects everybody, and I think this is very much shaping how the public is responding to this story.
Thanks. Emily?
I'll copy everything that Kate and Tim said, and just to add that when you actually look at the sort of what people are doing, there has been a reversion to going to trusted sources. So, you know, 83% of the UK are getting their news from the BBC outlets, and 80% of people are trusting what they see from the BBC.
Yes.
And I think it's very important when we start to think about how do we shape the working environment, the policies that underpin journalism, that we have that front and centre, which is actually, there are moments, the ABC in Australia found this with the bushfires, there are moments when really trustworthy, accountable media simply cannot be substituted for anything else. I think that is something which, again, speaking to my students, totally agree with everything that Tim said, is very inspiring. Was also to say that you can make the difference between life and death. You know, that reporting, we think about it as like yesterday's fish wrapper or something you swipe past on your phone. But it really can make the difference between life and death. And I think that hopefully the platforms, governments and media outlets themselves, as we go through this, will actually mean that sort of we start to build a more resilient future for journalism at all levels, at local level, national level, and international level.
That's a very optimistic note to end on. Thanks. I've been trying to keep my own views out of these as much as possible, but I would just say one thing, which is partly critical of my own profession, which is the academics, which is that I think there's been far too little understanding on a transdisciplinary level by academics as well of what's going on. I mean, I'm unusual in that I'm now a social scientist, but I started my working life as a lab technician in pharmaceuticals research, and I've maintained my interest in these issues ever since. So I've got a reasonably intelligent layperson's understanding of some of these issues, and I've got a lot of mates in those areas in various parts of academia who I talk to regularly, but an awful lot of academics have not got that. And while I was being critical of journalists for not having it, and some of our social science-based journalists, I think the same thing applies to us as well to a large extent. But thanks very much, all three of you, for joining us. That's been fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope maybe you can use some of this with your students. It's making good teaching material for some of the things that we've already recorded. People are using it all over the place. So thanks very much for joining me. I'm going to stop the recording.